welcome back to Zero Generation, the podcast for the dreamers who left home and are now making a new home abroad. Are now making a new home abroad. See, sometimes when I'm trying to speak phoneme, my tongue twists. But I'm happy to be here. This is a solo episode, and I will be talking through something that I'd hoped to have a guest on for, but all things work together for good because we're still going to talk about it. And in this day and age of Jackpa, there's the opposite of Jackpa, which is Japada. Now, let me explain it for anybody who might be listening who is not Nigerian or who is not familiar. Jakpa is a Yoruba phrase meaning to run away, basically to like make it out of a place, right? And people are now saying, the Nigerian dream is to Jakpa, is to leave, right? In the past, and I've said this in a couple of episodes so far, in the past 5 to 7 years, tens of thousands of young, professional, brilliant Nigerians have left to the UK, to Canada, and to the US and other European countries, even Australia, to try and make a new life because the economic conditions in Nigeria and the political conditions, the security conditions just seem to not be working, and it's stifling the creativity, it's stifling the financials. It's just an environment where people find it really hard to dream, and the world is such a global village now. It's like, if you don't have to do it, why do it? So I really understand this Jackpa movement. I moved to the US before the Jackpa movement. This is my 10th year in the US. I came for grad school and I ended up staying for obvious reasons. I got great work. I was having a good time. I enjoyed myself. And 10 years later, I now find myself thinking about Japada. I'll say that when I came in the beginning, I always had this mentality of, I can always move back. Like, I remember talking to a good friend when I was in grad school. She was also in grad school at the time. And I was like, yeah, if I graduate and I don't get a job, I'm going to go back home. And she was like, what do you mean? And I asked her, what do you mean? Do you mean you won't go back home if you don't get a job? You'd rather stay and become illegal? And she was like, yes. And I was like, I'm shocked. And she was like, I'm shocked that you would go back home because there's nothing back home. And I said, no, I don't think that's the right perspective, or I don't share that perspective, right? It might be her perspective and she has her reasons, but my experience in Nigeria and, my background, the kind of work that I had done before I moved gave me colored my perspective on Nigeria. And I feel that if I moved back, I would find my way. And I think not everybody feels that way. So, Jackpada, right? Why move back home? Is there a time to move back home? Is there, once you move, are you stuck? Like, do you have to prove a point? And on Twitter, this is a conversation that comes up every now and then. In fact, now it seems like every week there is, anti-Jackpa, pro-Jackpa, anti-Jackpada, and, all those things. So there is definitely a conversation around, and a lot of emotions, people have around moving away from home and moving back. To move from Nigeria now, I mean, the latest number that I've seen online is 40 million naira, which is slightly under $40,000. You need that to be able to do your exam, set up your bank accounts, etc., to be able to move. And there's a conversation of, if I had 40 million, why would I travel out? I'll just set up a business and stay. But imagine you put your life savings together and then you relocate, and then you get to wherever you are and you try to make it, and then you realize, I miss home, or for one reason or the other, you want to move back, right? Is there a right time to move back? Should you move back? What are the conditions for moving back? I don't even have answers. I just want to talk through my thoughts. I want to talk through some of the reasons why me, after 10 years, I'm now like, I've had a great run. I've had a good time in America, and I'm open to moving back. Maybe not immediately, but for me, once a thought starts percolating, it might take years, but it's, it will come to some kind of logical, fruition. I think one concern and one thing on my mind, and a lot of people that I've spoken to, friends and acquaintances, is aging parents. For our parents, it's hard to, first of all, it's hard to relocate and be away from your family, but the cost is even higher as you see your parents start to age. Imagine a family where all the children have relocated, or just one child is left, and that child bears the brunt of taking care of aging parents, being on call, going to see them if anything happens, making sure that they're taken care of. And we come from a community where you it's a circle of life. Your parents take care of you when you're young, and then you take care of your parents when you're old. And a lot of us take pride in being able to take care of our families, and we want to do more, and so I think about it. Thankfully, my parents are pastors. They have a community of really dedicated church members and a church community that loves them and is there for them. But I think constantly of, okay, I do want to have flexibility to be able to be with them physically, right? As time goes on, it's more important to me to spend time with them. How can I make this happen? I think about also another reason being raising children. I I talk to parents, and I'm so curious about, how are you raising a child with an American accent or with a British accent? Like, does it shock you when you hear them, when you hear them speak? And it's not just the accent, it's the ideas, the culture, the way of life. I think millennials are doing a really good job of parenting, especially the millennials who are parenting as immigrants and parenting abroad, because again, we have access to so much more information that the generations before us had. And I think, we're doing a good job of using that information for good and trying to parent these children who are nothing like us and are growing up in an environment that is nothing like the environment that we grew up in. But sometimes I think about, will it be easier to just raise children in Nigeria? I grew up in Nigeria. I went to Nigerian schools. I know what to look for in a good school. I know how to talk to teachers. I know how to suss out what's good and bad. I know how to create boundaries. Or at least I recognize the boundaries that my parents created for me when I was growing up, and kind of, discipline and reward systems that they had that may not necessarily work here. And then I ask myself, like, okay, is it just lazy, of me to think, it's harder to raise children here, so let me just go to Nigeria, let me ship them to Nigeria and do what was done, or some version of what was done to me. But I think it's a legitimate question, like, when it comes to raising children. And also, some of the episodes that we've had, we've talked about, like, the toll it takes on you as an immigrant when you first move. As a child, what does that look like, when again, thinking about my child who might grow up here, who's different, who eats eba and eforiro at home, who has parents who have accents, what kind of experiences will that child have? And will I necessarily protect them by moving back? That's another question that I think about raising children. Another thing I think about, and I took a deep breath here, because my nervous system, and what I mean is, I've talked about this in previous episodes with guests as well. There's a certain level of code switching that happens when you don't live at home. And as I said this, I think about a friend who told me after listening to the first episode that this reminds her of, the generations of people, maybe our parents or even our grandparents, who grew up in little villages and then moved to big cities, right? That was kind of a migration, and it might be what is now happening on a larger scale. But when you move, you kind of are, you have to grow in a way that you may not have needed to grow when you were not at home. And sometimes it takes a toll on your nervous system. I find that once I'm in a group of Nigerians, I find I'm able to relax, because I can be my real, true self, the one who is inside. I don't need to put on any airs. I don't need to put on any accent. I can just be myself. And so, why wouldn't I want that all the time, right? Or if not all the time, wouldn't I want the optionality of maybe a half and half? When I first moved here, maybe a few years in, I heard Chimamanda Adichie talk about how she, splits her time between the US and Nigeria. And I thought, oh my God, I want that. The optionality to be able to have, dual lives that are great. And you're like, okay, if I'm tired of the US, I can go to Nigeria. When I'm tired of Nigeria, I can come back to the US. Is that what Japada looks like? Where you then have set up yourself to be able to, live in two different countries and go back and forth, So, that's another thing. one other thing I think about is, am I idealizing home, right? Am I glamorizing home? Because I left 10 years ago. The Nigeria that was 10 years ago is not the Nigeria. I think Jonathan was president at that time. There was still there was still a lot more. We're already complaining, but we've always been complaining, but there was a lot more hope. I know, in fact, at that time, a lot of people in my age group who had gone to undergrad in the US and had done their masters actually moved back because there was some hope, around the Obasanjo years. But Nigeria has changed. you know, Everything has changed. Everything is so expensive. The other day I saw a tweet about how like Domino's pizza is 30,000 naira. And like, why is a box of pizza 30,000 naira? Things have changed. People are more stressed out. People are more anxious. Going out, having a social life is much more expensive. Even infrastructure has changed. So is home, this home that I'm yearning for or that I'm talking about, am I glamorizing it? Do I have the right view? Do I have an accurate perspective of home, right? That's something else that I think about. It's not the same way I left it. And it's going to be funny if I jackpada and then I start complaining because like, madam, do you know what you want? That's another thing, is this, home even real? Then, my partner, right? When I moved to the US, I was single and the world was my oyster. In fact, I was like, when I finished grad school, I could work in Singapore, I can go to the UK, I can go anywhere. But my options are now, I wouldn't say narrower, but there's another person to consider. My husband moved to the US after we got married and is progressing in his career. And so I have to take in account that he has to get a return on his investment, or he has to feel a very strong sense of a return on his investment before he moves back, or he has to feel a strong sense to want to move back. It can't just be me anymore. So I have that to consider. It's not just me anymore. I think about, what would life look like in Nigeria? What are the trade-offs, right? Of like, having the comforts here in the US of access to healthcare, access to, a infrastructure, an emergency system that works, basic amenities that work, electricity, running water, things that I don't even have to think about now that would be top of mind immediately I land in Murtala Mohammed Airport, versus the comforts of home in Nigeria, where at a certain financial level, you have the comforts of labor that take care of things for you. So cleaner, cook, driver, all of that. And it's not like you can't get that in the US, but you get it at a much higher cost. And you find that people make do with their own labor. They replace that with their own labor where they can. Like, I don't know many people that have a driver, in the US. And, that is just taken for granted when you're in Nigeria. So I weigh the pros and cons of the comforts, of both sides of the house. Another thing that I think about, or when I think about people who have successfully moved back, is actually one person who I would have loved to have to talk about this. People like Bio Lion, Adedeji, who had a great career in the US, came from Nigeria, was already doing a lot of great entrepreneurship in Nigeria. He moved to the US, worked in a lot of great companies. And then I remember we were both at the same company and he was like, Dami, I cannot make it big as much as I will make it in Nigeria. I'm going to move back. I have to move back. And within 2 years, he had gone back and he's doing amazingly well now, and inspiring like people in his own way. And so I think it's doable. Japada is doable. Like if you have a clear view of what you want out of life, if you've tasted and sampled and you're like, all right, I've gotten what I want and I want to go back home and really make it, because for whatever reason, home is now, where it's at for me and where I think I'm going to strike out. It reminds me of, this story, in the Bible of Naomi and Ruth and Orpah, whose families left Israel. This is a story in the Bible, right? When there was famine, and then they went to another land. I can't remember the name right now, but then there was news that there was bread again in Israel, and they had gone through a lot of hardship, and so they came back. Only Ruth and Naomi made it back. but they came back. And so, maybe there's going to be a time again when, quote and unquote, there is bread again in Nigeria, and there will be a mass Japada back to Nigeria. And we won't come with, just as we left, but we'll come back with all that we've gained, right, from where we were. Is this a pipe dream? I don't know, but I can't help but think of those parallels and those analogies. When I also think another argument that I have with myself when I think about moving back, or when I think about why people might want to move back or not want to move back, is that they might be afraid to admit that being abroad was not all that they thought it would be. To come back and say, I didn't love it. I gave it my best and I didn't love it. I think it takes a lot of courage. I had said in the beginning that it takes a lot of courage to leave. It takes even more courage to return, because you're essentially saying, I went, I tasted it, and I want what I had. And I think that might be something that people are afraid to say, people are afraid to speak up about, or when people do speak up about it, they're shut down because people are like, you don't know what you're talking about. Please just go and sit somewhere. You're trying to discourage people from relocating. But, depending on where we are in our lives, I think, it was LD who talked about the hierarchy of needs, right? You get to a point where you've met a lot of things on that hierarchy, and then you realize you need self-actualization. And, at that point, hopefully, we are humble enough and not afraid to say, it's time to move back, even though it might not be the popular thing, even though it might not be the in thing, or, people might say, who even cares? Honestly, who cares what people say? I think what I've always wanted for myself, is, as someone who I was born in Ibadan, and I love Ibadan, and I will tolerate no shade about Ibadan. I love the fact that I grew up around really wholesome people who love to think and who are like intellectually independent. They might not be as risk taking as people from Lagos, or as showy as people from Lagos, but they tend to be muted. They tend to not show off, which I love and which are personal values that I have. But I knew that I wanted to see the world. I knew that there was a whole world outside of Ibadan, right, that I wanted to experience. And I always wanted that sense of freedom and agency to design my life, or at least to follow God's design for my life, and not to feel like I had to follow this path where I am born here and I will live here and work here, marry here, have children here, and die here. I really wanted to see the world, and I've been very privileged to be able to explore some of my, to be able to fulfill some of those dreams and explore some of the places that I had seen on television and that I had, dreamt of going to. I've lived in Chicago is where I first came when I moved to Nigeria. I've lived in, then I went to Palo Alto for a summer, and I was in the Bay Area working as an intern. And then I moved to Seattle for a tech job after grad school. And I lived in Seattle for 3-4 years. And then I moved to, actually, no, 2 years. Then I moved to Austin, which was where I actually lived for 4 years. And then now I live in, Cambridge, in the greater Boston area. And so I've gotten to see so many cities in the US. And I ask myself, when people ask, what's your favorite? Chicago is by far my favorite. But everywhere, it just doesn't feel like home. Like, it's almost like I'm searching for something that I can't quite put my finger on. And it may be a city in the US that I've not experienced yet. It may be a city somewhere in the world outside of Nigeria that I haven't experienced yet. Or it may just be back home with my people. I want the freedom to design my life just in the same way that design came, and I left Nigeria and came here and have stayed so far and will probably stay for several more years. But I do want to always feel like I'm not stuck. There's this saying that you are not a tree. Move. If you don't like where you are, move. I think it's an ethos that has helped me and has probably made me move to all these different cities, and it's one that I hope that I continue to keep, and it's one that I hope that when it comes the time to decide to, move back or to move somewhere else or to make a decision that's not very popular at the time, that I hope it's an ethos that will give me the courage to really step out and do, what I need to do or what God is leading me to do in that moment. And so yeah, this is, my thoughts on Japada. I probably will talk about it again with someone because I'm so curious to hear about what people are thinking, both about both Jakpa and Japada. And yeah, there we go. This is Zero Generation, the podcast for the dreamers who left home and are making a home abroad. As always, you can catch us on all podcast platforms, Zero Generation, as well as on my social media at Onwah on all platforms. And you can read my essays because I'm always percolating and writing things about being a dreamer who left home. You can read my essays on my website, damilolaonwah.com. See you all next time.